at least quite often. We have no other possibility to write a good commentary than to steal things from each other. But this is the idea quite worst.
It's exciting.
Yes, but still, I would like to ask, what are the indications that this particular story we are talking about took place in the Gentile area? Just the fact that
well, yeah, back in 731, we had this tour, and I think we talked about this last time.
Yes.
That he goes, and it doesn't make straightforward geographical sense, but he's in the area of Tyre and Sidon, and he goes to the Sea of Galilee, going through the Decapolis. So I guess the question is, which side of the Sea of Galilee is he on?
Yes. In any case, we have here the Orestes.
Yeah.
Ace 10 Telecentres Galileas.
Yeah.
So he was definitely not in the area of Tyre or Sidon, not even in the area of Decapolis. But the problem is whether he was on the east or west side of the Galilee.
I mean, if he's just gone through the Decapolis and then reached the Sea of Galilee, he'd be on the east side. So that's the only location indication. And there's also, at the end of the passage in verse 10, he goes to Dalmanutha, and I forget where that is. That's the other location. But the other thing that people point to is the numbers of those fed in the two stories.
Mm-hmm.
In the previous story, it was 5 loaves and 12 fish, which are kind of Jewish numbers, right? 5 books of Moses, 12 tribes. Here it's feeding of it's 4,000 people, whereas before it was 5,000. So there's again that 5 number. And I mean, people relate the 4,000 to the 4 corners of the earth, and also, and this I don't think is as strong an argument, the 7 fish, because I mean, 7 is used for so many things in the Bible that I'm not sure you can say it's a particularly Jewish or non-Jewish number. But there's like 70 nations in, I think, some Jewish traditions about the world. But so I mean, these are all kind of questionable arguments, but that's the sort of thing that people point to.
Yes. The word that drew my attention was the word ochlos. Do we have in the Gospel of Mark ochlos when the Gospel writer speaks about the non-Jewish population?
Well, it's usually the Jewish population because that's where Jesus spends most of his time. right? I mean, there's only exceptional stories that have people who are obviously Gentiles. There's the Syrophoenician woman, there's the Gerasene demoniac, and his neighbors in chapter 5, and then there's the centurion in chapter 15. There's no ochlos in chapter 15. In chapter 5, I don't think ochlos occurs in the Gerasene demoniac story. So you're right that ochlos is generally associated with a Jewish crowd, but I would say that's because Jesus is generally operating in Jewish areas.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
One can ask that Jesus was accused for many things, but never for eating with the uncircumcised. And why should his disciples feed the uncircumcised?
Well, yeah, I think that's a good question. But I would distinguish between what the historical Jesus did and, the image of Jesus that Mark is fashioning. I mean, certainly, if I agree with you, say if Jesus had said something like what Mark says in chapter 7 about all foods being clean, if he had said that publicly, there would have been what we call blowback. Somebody would have objected. So I think it's likely that Jesus' eating habits were within the Jewish kosher laws. I mean, here, I don't know how, one would view this feeding from the point of view of Jewish eating practices. I mean, Jesus is not eating with the crowd. It doesn't say the disciples are eating. What the disciples are doing is distributing the food to the crowd. So I'm not sure, even from the point of view of Jewish eating practices, which we don't know the details about, how did Jews and Gentiles eat together? I mean, it seems to be a problem in Galatians for some reason, and that may be because of conceptions about Gentiles being unclean, though the point is disputed. So, but I think my basic answer would be that we're dealing with the image of Jesus that Mark is fashioning for his own purposes, which probably, I would say, have more to do with Gentiles than the historical Jesus had to do with Gentiles. How does my answer strike you?
Thank you.
I mean, I think it's a really good question, though.
Yes, this is true that there is no indication that Jesus or his disciples ate this bread together with the ochlos.
And I think, this is an important point to remember that, somebody, British New Testament scholar A.E.R. Harvey wrote a book called Jesus and the Constraints of History that And I think that title is important, that, you know, there are times when the history exercised a constraint or a restraint, you know, that, I mean, I don't think the gospel writers just made things up freely. And, you know, they stretched things sometimes, or they turned them in various directions. But I had a colleague, Paul Meyer, who used to say this about, you know, something related to what Larissa mentioned. The question of circumcision, not eating with the circumcised, but circumcision. It was a big dispute within the early church. You know, did those who were not from Jewish backgrounds, who became part of the movement, did the males need to be circumcised? You know, and Paul debates this in Galatians, and, you know, we know it was a big question and it caused controversy. But why isn't there, if the gospel writers had made up things freely just to suit their purposes, why doesn't anybody make up a story in which Jesus says something about circumcision? And Meyer's answer was probably because Jesus didn't say anything about circumcision. It, you know, the question didn't come up because he was operating almost entirely in the Jewish sphere. So I guess this, you know, partly contradicts what I said earlier. I think, you know, we're dealing in the Gospels with Jesus' image as reflected and refracted through the later concerns of the church, but the later church it wasn't totally just imaginative. It didn't totally read its own theology into the Jesus tradition, but it stretched things that were maybe already there in the tradition and tried to turn them for its own theology or different theologies.
When I speak with my students on the topic of Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism of the Hellenistic and Roman period, I say that there were three pillars of Jewish identity in this period, namely male circumcision, the food laws, and Sabbath. All the three elements were quite often topics of Gentiles' mockery on the Jews. And all the three topics were often discussed in Jewish Hellenistic apologetic treatises to show that our legislator didn't bother about pigs and so on, but about the symbolic meaning of these pigs and so on and so on. It's interesting that in the gospel, such a stress is laid on the Sabbath, but not a single word is said about circumcision, and the food laws are probably only hinted at, like the saying that we just read a week ago, 2 weeks ago, that by saying this, Jesus meant that all food is clean. This is not even put in the mouth of Jesus himself, and it's said in a very, I would like to say, in a very indirect way. While in the letters of Paul, we have completely different situation. For Paul, the main problems of his of his missionary activity with the Gentiles, and the main problems of his communities were circumcision and Jewish food laws. As far as I remember, there are no direct attacks on the Sabbath on behalf of Paul. Sometimes he reproaches his addressees that you are trying to observe times and so on, which may be understood as some kind of polemics against the observance of Sabbath, but also in a very indirect way.
Only in Romans 14 and 15, I think that comes up. You observe days and seasons, and yeah.
Yes, but still, the emphasis in the Gospels, in the Gospel narrative, is put on completely different things than in Paul's letters.
And
how would you explain this?
I guess my former colleague, now deceased, Paul Meyer, would say maybe that's because the Sabbath, was already a matter of controversy for the historical Jesus. In particular, and we can see that, how one should observe the Sabbath was a matter of dispute amongst Jewish groups as well.
Mm-hmm.
In the tradition, I don't think you get, Jesus doesn't dispute that, well, at least in the synoptics, he doesn't dispute that the Sabbath should be observed, but it's a question of how it should be observed. And, indirectly, what constitutes work? Is it work and therefore a violation of the Sabbath to heal on the Sabbath?
But then, how can we explain the fact that if this was already a topic for discussion in the days of historical Jesus, and it was probably when we read the Gospels as a historical narrative about historical Jesus, Sabbath was probably one of the main points of controversy between Jesus and Judaism. How can we explain that this topic almost completely disappeared in Pauline thought, being replaced by other topics of controversy?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because take into account Paul's mission activity and his idea of reaching the Gentiles, it's quite understandable that he might have broadened the topics of discussion and polemics with the mainstream Judaism. But on the one hand, he broadened it by including the topics of circumcision and food laws. On the other hand, he put the topic of Sabbath aside.
The thing that's different about circumcision is that it's an entry ritual, right? Whereas food laws and Sabbath are just things that every Jew did, but circumcision for males, again, is how you become Jewish. So it's I'm not sure what relevance that has, but it is different. It's a one-time event, as opposed to Sabbath, occurs every 7 days, and food laws come into effect every day, several times a day. But I'm not sure how to answer your question. I think it's a good question. I'd like to think about it some more. Yeah, why are, I mean, it's a subset of a larger question. Why are some things which are important in the Gospels not important in Paul, and vice versa?
Okay. Take into account the fact that we have two stories so close to each other. Probably we may just compare these two stories in order to understand what differences, symbolic or historical, can we see between these two accounts. Вот вы, друзья, как вы отнеслись бы к идее того, чтобы сейчас мы просто-напросто посмотрели бы, пытались бы посмотреть точки схождения и расхождения между историями о насыщении Иисусом людей в 6 главе и в 8 главе. Нормально это будет? Интересно для нашего семинара?
Да, конечно.
Давайте так и сделаем. Давайте, сейчас, секундочку. Вот сейчас пока не видно. Ты меня... Нет? Сейчас. Мгм. Видите, вот сейчас видно, что я меняю на экране один текст на другой, да? Вот сейчас я смотрю, это у меня 6 глава наша диглотта. И вот сейчас 8 глава наша диглотта, правильно?
Да.
Окей, давайте тогда попробуем, как в каких-нибудь таких квизах посмотреть сходство и различия, да? I just try to compare these two stories in two different windows, but probably we can try to put them side by side. What is better?
Side by side.
Side by side. Okay, then I do it in Greek. Wait a second. I'll take chapter 6, verses 35 through 44. Yes.
Mhm. I did this in my commentary, but it took 3 pages of of the English, of just the English translations, because I also had a third column where I put John, who only has one feeding, by the way, which is, I think, relevant for this question of doublets.
Maybe you're right. Maybe I can just show your commentary in this. Okay.
Yeah, but it's a lot. Yeah, pages 493 to 495.
Yes. Okay. This may be better than to create a new table.
And I won't enforce copyright. You can show my commentary
Thank you very much.
without sending me like 10 rubles.
Oh, we can do it. It's not a problem. The Markan and Johannine feeding miracles. We saw a great crowd, and there was again a great crowd. The words crowd refer here in English, translate the Greek ochlos. So there is a certain parallelism.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels. Yeah.
Yes, and in John also, I think crowd.
Yeah, it's always ochlos. Yeah.
Says ochlos. Okay, I just draw attention to this point because once again, I think whether the usage of ochlos here is can be regarded as a sign that Jewish people is being meant in all the 3 stories, but this is a different question that we have already talked about earlier. Okay, great crowd. Let me check. Great crowd is ochlos polus in all 3 places. Yeah.
Yeah, and these sort of similarities come up in discussions of whether there's a literary relationship between John and the synoptics. I mean, that seems to be more where a lot of the contemporary scholarship is heading, though I'm not convinced yet, that John knew any of the synoptics, that he had read any of them, or that he had them in front of him when he was writing, but rather maybe he has you know, he has certain traditions in common with the synoptics.
So I agree with you that the idea that he had some common source with the synoptics is much more probable, because otherwise it would be completely ununderstandable why John should have omitted such an amount of material from the synoptics. Yes, okay. They didn't have anything to eat. Jesus said, I have pity on the crowd.
I think splunk nitsnomai in both cases in Mark.
Yes. His disciples said, send them away so that I might buy something to eat. But the disciples were wondering, how can we buy such an amount of food for them? It's interesting that in John, it is Jesus who raises the question, not the disciples.
Yeah, and I mean, Jesus takes the initiative more in John, right?
Yes, and
I think that corresponds to his higher Christology.
yes, and also this is the fact that Jesus took the initiative is strengthened in John by the explicit indication that this he said testing his disciples.
Because John knows that, you know, putting this question in from Jesus may make the readers think, well, didn't Jesus know what he was going to do? And then he answers his own question. Or the evangelist answers the question that he's afraid might occur to the reader, that will diminish the omniscience of Jesus.
Yes, it's interesting that the explicit mention of 200 denarii makes the first feeding story closer to John than to the second story in Mark.
Well, yeah, and in John it's also closer because it's a feeding of 5,000, right? John has only the feeding of the 5,000, which is the first feeding in Mark.
Yes. Then we come to the numbers of loaves and fishes that you said might have had symbolic meaning as markers of Jewish and non-Jewish background.
And John is the only one who mentions that they're barley loaves. And this was significant for one of my teachers, Raymond Brown, who thought that this is a detail that does not have, he argued, it isn't symbolic. There's no particular symbolic meaning to barley, but it was the sort of thing that, you know, Galilean peasants probably ate. It's the food of the poor. So he thinks it's a historical reminiscence. And that was part of his argument, you know, that there is, you know, contrary to what most people think, John is the most spiritual, symbolic, and unhistorical gospel. He thought that was a historical reminiscence.
Okay. But as concerns the numbers and their symbolisms, one cannot fail to notice that 5 plus 2 makes 7. So 5 loaves plus 2 fishes in Mark, and the same number of barley loaves and fishes in John. They just equate 7 loaves in the second Markan story.
Well, that's very interesting, and I never noticed that before. Oh. Huh.
I do not know what does this mean, but if we take for granted, and I think that's a good point of departure, that the numbers here are symbolic, then I think we shouldn't omit the fact that 5 plus 2 makes exactly 7. So it's
Yeah, now that's good. Brown didn't have much of a mathematical background, so he may not have realized that 5 plus 2 equals 7. No, that's, and I don't know why I've never thought about this either. So I like that.
okay. Well, one more topic for an article
Yeah.
on the usage of mathematics in New Testament studies. Yes, anakline versus anapesein.
Mm-hmm.
We have here maybe I'm not from the first glance. What word? Which of these two words seems to be more higher, belong to the higher stratum of the Greek language?
I don't know. I mean, the Gospels usually use anakline, or some variation of that, anaklino. And I mean, I guess I would think that anaklino is a more elevated language, because of the similarity to, people in the Greco-Roman world reclining at meals.
Yes, it.
And the other thing that one needs to compare is the accounts of the Last Supper, because I mean, some of this language, and we haven't gotten into it yet, points forward to that, to the gospel accounts and also Paul's account. And I think maybe anaklino is used there. So yeah. No, just
No.
as they were eating. Yeah. Mark 14:22 and following.
Yes, I looked for anaklinein in the Gospels. No, it doesn't have association with the Last Supper.
Okay.
But rather it has some association with the feast. Yes, like eschatological feast in Matthew 8:11.
Yeah, parallel Luke. Yeah, it's a Q saying about, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so unclean, that's about the eschatological dinner.
Mhm.
Is it the correct way of talking in the discussion of eschatological dinner, or how would you call this in English?
Let's say eschatological banquet.
Eschatological banquet. Yes.
Yeah. And yeah, banquet is a more special meal. I'm not sure I've ever been to a banquet.
Eschatological.
Eschatological or non-eschatological. Yeah. No, I guess, like when I played sports in high school, at the end of the year, we would have a banquet. So those are the only banquets I think I've been to.
Yes. Let's look at the distribution of an unclean in the Gospels. Do you see? Yes. The word is not frequent.
Mhm.
It occurs in Mark only in our place.
Mhm.
In Matthew, it occurs in our place, taken over from Mark, and also in the Jesus saying about the eschatological banquet.
Yeah, and let's pause there, right? Many come from the east and west and will recline with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of God, but the children of the kingdom will be cast out. So at least in some interpretations, this is about Gentiles coming and becoming part of the chosen people.
Yes. And we also have the same Q saying in Luke
Mhm.
13.
Yeah.
And also with the same almost same continuation that some of those are last now but shall be first, and there are some are first now but shall be last.
Mhm.
But it's interesting that if we go back to the synoptic table that we have in your commentary, then this eschatological banquet topic, the word that is used in the topic in the context of eschatological banquet occurs during the first feeding.
Mhm.
Though in Q context, it rather refers to the eschatological banquet of Gentiles
Mhm.
on the background of Jews being expelled from the kingdom.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe anaklinai is a more theological term, that has more eschatological implications,
Yes.
and anapasein is not. And again, it seems to me that this difference in terminology suggests development of oral tradition, where you can have one word substituting for another.
Mhm.
And maybe one teller sharpens the meaning in a particular direction by using another synonymous word.
Yes. Now let's look at the distribution of anapasein in the Bible. in the New Testament. Also, not too much, but the electronic concordance reminds us that in Mark 6:40, the eschatological, as we decided, word anaklinein is used in the mouth of Jesus. But when we come to actual description of what happened, they anepesen. And
Yeah, so I'd say it's a more prosaic term, just
yes,
set down.
it occurs several times in different parables in Luke, while dealing with, while describing different occurrences of Jesus dining with different people. But at least in Luke, that's an episode occurs also in the description of the Last Supper.
Right.
Not anaklinein, but anapese. Okay. It's interesting.
Yeah, whereas, I mean, one might think that anakline is more appropriate, not only, because it's a more, maybe, theological term, but also, if this is supposed to be a Passover Seder, or to have some elements of a Passover Seder, the whole idea of reclining, and is comes into that.
Okay, but in any case, we see that each of these two words has its own set of connotations, and probably it's not just by chance that in different stories here, different verbs are used.
Yes, could be. Yeah. I mean, I did, while I was writing my commentary, often I wondered how far should I press a particular word and see significance in it. And, was this something that Mark had consciously in mind, or am I like reading things in and paying more attention to his word choices than he was paying himself? But I was always asking myself that.
Yes. Then we continue our story. He blessed in the first story of Logison, then also Eucharistasis with regard to laws.
Yeah,
and
this is the closest similarity to the Last Supper. These three actions: he blessed, he broke, and he gave it. That's what Jesus does in the Last Supper accounts.
But also as concerns these two terms, Eucharisteo and Eulogeo, in first story, he blessed Eulogison. the loaves of bread, but nothing is said about what words or symbolic deeds accompanied the distribution of 2 fishes.
Yeah.
In
Yeah,
in the
I mean, the bread is more important, one would think, right?
yes, in second story, the distribution of bread is introduced by giving thanks, Eucharistesis, while the eulogia, the blessing, is moved to blessing of fishes. Blessing still didn't disappear. It was just moved from bread to fishes. In John,
Okay.
he gave thanks, Eucharistesis, and no eulogia.
Yeah, and of course, it's the bread that is the parallel, with the Last Supper and also with the Moses miracles.
Yes, exactly.
And not the fish. Whereas, if I was there, I would be more interested in the fish, personally. But I think it probably does relate to these liturgical actions that are known to Mark's hearers, having to do with the bread.
Yes, of course. Bread has a Old Testament, good Old Testament genealogy in manna, while fish do not have any Old Testament genealogy.
But here also, I think, one could, it's an obvious point, but one could mention, again, my colleague Paul Meyer's thing about the constraints of history. If he really wanted to make this exactly parallel to the Last Supper, Jesus should have fed them wine also. And he doesn't, so it's not total, like, just back formation from the Last Supper narrative. And as you say, the fish, it's difficult to see symbolism in them. I think maybe some people have related it to, like in Isaiah, there's mention of eschatological banquet, and they'll eat Leviathan. But these are much smaller. These are smaller fish.
Yes, but as an Old Testament scholar, I must tell you that Leviathan is not a fish at all.
What is it? What is it?
Though he lives in the waters, it's a creature of completely different nature. Not an ordinary fish, and not even a big fish.
You mean it's a whale? Or is that what you're saying? It's some sort of sea creature, right?
It's some sort of a sea creature, but he has a lot of heads, and that's a sea monster which resembles an ordinary fish much less than a whale do.
Okay.
So then we have, I think we have some time just to finish your table.
Okay. Yeah.
The eaters were 5,000 people in first feeding story, 4,000 people in second feeding story, and once again 5,000 people in John. And they embark.
Well, yeah, and also another similarity, I didn't put it on the chart, but I think I mentioned it somewhere. So each of these stories is then followed by a sea voyage in which something happens.
Mhm.
I think in Mark and in the first Mark story and in John, it's Jesus walks on the water. And then in each case, I think also in John, it's followed by some, discussion with the disciples about bread.
Yes. Okay. We compared the two stories.
So what do you think about the numbers? 4,000 versus 5,000, 5 loaves and 12 fish versus 5 loaves and 12 baskets versus 4, I think, or maybe I'm thinking of the 4,000. Okay, 7 baskets, yeah. 12 baskets in the first Mark story, 7 in the second. 4,000 people versus 5,000.
Yes, I don't know. But wait a second. In John, according to your table, they gathered 12 baskets of finus from the 5 barley loaves, while earlier, according to your table, they had 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, 2 prepared fish of Saria.
So in general, John is much closer to the first story in Mark.
Yes, but John says nothing about the
remnants.
The remnants of the fish. They took up 12 baskets of fragments of bread and fish. In John, they have 12 baskets only from barley loaves. But maybe it's not important.
Or maybe they were like me, they were more interested in the fish, so they ate up all the fish and there wasn't anything left over.
Yeah. In stories like this, it's really difficult to draw a line between details that have symbolic meanings and details that haven't symbolic meanings.
I mean, 12, the 12 baskets, that seems, pretty, it's just so strongly associated with Jewish things, 12 tribes of Israel, that I think it's safe to say is symbolic. I'm less sure about, the 5 as, being somehow related to the 5 books of Moses.
Yes. Okay. There were some more interesting things that I saw in your commentary, including the Exodus typology. But probably we do not have time to discuss this. So, of course, for Old Testament scholars present here, the Exodus typology would have been especially interesting.
Well, I think it'll come up in the next passage too, where Jesus quizzes the disciples about these numbers. So,
yes. Okay. So I think that this topic, or the banquet, which is also a hint of an eschatological banquet that awaits Christians, it's a very good point for us to end our studies of this semester and to think about the eschatological banquet of these festival days. And we wish each other Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
same to you. How do you say Merry Christmas in Russian? Don't say it. Larissa says you don't say it. Okay. So Novim Godu.
No, in Russian in Russian culture, modern Russian culture, Christmas is not, in fact, a national holiday. Believers say each other с Рождеством Христовым, which means literally, I congratulate you with the nativity of Christ. That's what I tried to say in English, to express in English at the very beginning of our today's meeting, but you corrected me saying that neither British nor Americans do say it this way. But sometimes I heard, or at least I read in the Christmas wishes, blessed Christmas.
Mhm.
Is this natural English?
Well, now, I've noticed since I've moved to North Carolina in the South, where there's more influence of, I think, Christian culture, people will say, have a blessed day.
Have a blessed day.
Yeah. But it's not particularly Christmas. They'll just, wish you a blessed day. And it's a way of conveying that they're Christians and that they think you are too, or they wish you were, or something like that. But that's, the only place one generally hears that term, I think, in normal speech outside of church. But anyway, I have a New Year's Eve party, and which I wish you could come to sometime, but I will be thinking of you on New Year's Eve. So Novim Godu. I wish you.
Thank you for having been with us throughout all these meetings. It was
John, thank you very much.
Thank
it was
you.
our joint privilege.
I enjoy it. It's my privilege. And I'll see you in January
Thank you.
sometime.
Thank
Okay,
you.
до свидания. Bye.
До свидания.
Thank you.